Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, best-selling author Robert Spencer chronicles the relationship between Muslims and Christians. He argues that modern Islamic terrorists share a similar ideology as other Muslims throughout history. From Politically Incorrect Guide Day 2007, this is 40 Minutes.
Our next speaker on this fascinating day when we're demolishing all kinds of politically correct sayings that we hear in our country is Robert Spencer. He is the director of Jihad Watch and an adjunct fellow with the Free Congress Foundation. He has had many articles and had many appearances on television, and he is the author of the Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. Please welcome Robert Spencer.
I don't know if you've seen the news today. Salman Rushdie is in the news again, the Pakistani British citizen novelist who is in the news for just having been knighted by the Queen. There have been today of course is Friday. Friday is the day on which in Islam one goes to the mosque and hears a sermon. And today, evidently all over Central Asia, in Salman Rushdie's native land and neighboring lands, there were sermons denouncing his being knighted and calling for action in retaliation, revenge. And so Muslims came out of the mosques and took to the streets and called for blood, called for Rushdie to be shot dead, called for retaliation against the British. And, of course, all of this, as several speakers in the Pakistani parliament and elsewhere have explained, it's all our fault. It's all the British Crown's fault and the British government's fault for giving this honor to Rushdie, who, of course, if you don't know, 17 years ago he wrote a novel that contains a rather unflattering portrait of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad. And this was considered to be blasphemous by the government of Iran at the time, and he was given a death fatwa. Fatwa was a religious ruling. He was condemned to death, and the Iranian government offered a bounty that anybody who killed him would be paid and rewarded by the Iranian government. Of course, he has never given anyone an opportunity to collect, but this bounty has been renewed several times, and the death fatwa, the death sentence on Rushdie's head, has been renewed several times over the years, including yesterday. This creates some very uncomfortable problems for the West, and for the United States in particular, because we are in the position of aiding what many people believe in the Muslim world is a blasphemer, somebody who has offended against religious piety. And really, you know, Americans, being a fundamentally religious people even to this day, for the most part, don't want to be in that kind of position and find that uncomfortable, and tend to maybe even have a sympathetic response, especially since Salman Rushdie himself, having come west, having been enriched in the West, having been lionized in the West, is nevertheless just as much of a venomous critic of Western civilization as anyone in the Islamic world today. They think, how on earth can we defend somebody like this? And this comes to fundamental questions about what we're facing in the war on terror today, and what it means for us as Americans and as inheritors of Western Judeo-Christian civilization. This is because this comes to the heart of fundamentally different ideas of what it means to be a human being standing before God, and what the implications of that are. And a lot of this, not coincidentally, also connects to the Crusades. Bill Clinton, right after 9/11, said it was all because of the Crusades. The Islamic world was attacked in an unprovoked attack. In 1099, the Crusaders sacked Jerusalem with unbelievable brutality. Memories are long in the Islamic world. They still tell those stories about the Crusaders massacring people knee-deep in blood in the streets. And this is why they hate us. It's all our fault. We provoked them in the Crusades and have continued to provoke them through colonialism and so on, all the way down to the present day. And this is why we had 9/11. And this is why we have rioters in the streets today all over Central Asia, because of this action by the British government. Now, two fundamentally different ideas of the human person and of that person's responsibility before God. All of this has to do with that. Because in the Islamic world, the idea of God, the idea of Allah in Islam, is that of what we would term a dictator. Those of you who are coming, which I assume is the overwhelming majority of you coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, think of God as Father, and are used to the idea that a religion will teach fundamentally the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the idea that one must be charitable to one's neighbor. People assume this to a tremendous degree. Even today in our post-Christian society, people assume that anything that goes by the name of a religion must teach universal love, universal benevolence, and charity. That is not the case. In the Islamic religion, if you read the Quran, the holy book of Islam, if you read the life of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and if you study the history of Islam, you will find again and again, all the way through all the sacred texts of Islam, and all the way through Islamic history and culture, you find a very sharp division between the believers and the unbelievers. The believers are the ones who are blessed. The believers are the ones who are favored. The unbelievers have no standing whatsoever, no dignity as human persons, no obligation to love them, no obligation to be good to them, no obligation toward them whatsoever. As a matter of fact, you have a responsibility, according to the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29, you can check up on me on that, the responsibility to wage war against the unbelievers, particularly against Jews and Christians, who are referenced in that verse, in order to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law, which in this view is considered the law of God. Now, what does this have to do with the Crusades, and what does this have to do with Salman Rushdie? Everything. The Crusades were presented by Bill Clinton, by many others, even to, you hear this all the time. You can probably turn on the television and hear somebody saying it today, as the beginning of the suspicion and hostility between the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world. Actually, the Crusades were a late and small-scale defensive response to 450 years of warfare waged by the Islamic world against non-Muslims in order to fulfill the imperative preached by the Quran and by Muhammad to subjugate the unbelievers under the rule of Islamic law, not to force them to convert. That's a very common misconception. Not to make them, compel them to be Muslims, but to subjugate them as second-class citizens. Non-Muslims do not, under the teachings of, under the traditional holdings of Islamic law, they do not enjoy equality of rights with Muslims. They do not enjoy full citizenship status. They have to pay a special tax. They have to accept a large number of humiliating and discriminatory regulations that make sure that they feel themselves subdued, which is what is mandated in the Quran, in that same verse, 929. Now, 450 years of warfare. The Islamic armies came out of Arabia. Muhammad died in 632. Almost immediately, the Islamic armies began to pour out of Arabia into the neighboring lands. Were those lands Muslim? No, of course not. They were Christians. They had been, that was over half of Christendom, and they had been Christian lands for 600 years. Syria, Egypt, all of North Africa, Lebanon, some of the greatest saints of the Christian tradition. Athanasius, the author of the Nicene Creed, the St.